Kyle grabbed her wrist before she reached the stairwell. He dragged her back. "Where do you think you're going?" "Leave me alone," she shouted. Penelope ran. She burst into the wet morning air, shoes pounding the pavement, breath coming in sharp bursts. She did not look back. A black car slowed beside her. She barely noticed it until the back door opened, and a man stepped directly into her path. She stopped short. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly pressed dark suit. His gaze went straight to her swollen cheek and stayed there. "Who did that to your face?" he asked quietly. Penelope opened her mouth. Her throat was tight. Her lungs were still burning. She was standing in front of her employer on a public pavement at 7 in the morning looking exactly like what she was. A woman who had been hit and had run here because here was the only direction she knew how to run. Seo Junho waited. He did not fill the silence. He did not look around. He did not soften the question or reach toward her, or do any of the things that people did when they wanted to appear helpful, while keeping a careful distance from the actual situation. He stood and waited with his eyes on her face, and gave her the complete space of the question. She did not get to answer. "Penelope." Kyle's voice came from directly behind her. "Close." She felt the air change before she heard the footstep. Her whole body pulled tight from the soles of her feet upward. The involuntary, muscle-memorized preparation of someone who had learned to brace before the moment arrived. Kyle stopped 3 feet back. He looked at Junho with a relaxed and slightly amused assessment of a man who had never encountered an obstacle he could not eventually move. He took in the suit, the car, the driver sitting behind the wheel without moving, and he ran his private calculation quickly and quietly behind his eyes. He decided this was manageable. "She is my girlfriend," Kyle said, keeping his voice friendly, almost warm. "We had a disagreement this morning. Private matter." He glanced at Penelope, a look that carried its own complete private language, every word of which she already knew by heart, and then back at Junho. "If you could give us a moment, I would appreciate it." Junho turned toward Kyle. He did it slowly, the way a man turns when he has made a deliberate decision to give something his full and undivided attention. He looked at Kyle's face, then at his hands, then at his face again. "No," Junho said. Kyle's jaw moved forward slightly. "Excuse me?" "She works for me," Junho said. "She is already late." Her face was not like that yesterday. Kyle laughed, short, disbelieving, the laugh of a man who has decided the person in front of him does not fully understand the situation. "I do not know who you are, but this does not concern you." "I know who you are," Junho said. The laugh stopped. Junho took 1 step toward Kyle. 1 step. His hands went into his trouser pockets. His expression did not shift by a single degree. He looked at Kyle with the specific calm of a man who had never once in his professional life needed volume to make something land exactly where he intended it. "If you touch her again," Junho said, "you lose your hands." The delivery rider outside the convenience store had gone completely still. The 2 women with the paper cups had stopped talking. The security guard at the lobby had turned his head without moving the rest of his body. Kyle stood very still. Something moved behind his eyes. His pride was loud. It had always been loud, but underneath it something older and more honest sent a clear signal upward that his pride could not fully override. The signal said, "This man means exactly what he just said." Not as a figure of speech. Not as a warning designed to dissolve once the stranger walked away. As a precise and literal description of what would actually happen. Kyle looked at Penelope one final time. She was looking at the building entrance beyond Junho's shoulder. Kyle straightened his jacket with both hands. 1 step back. Then another. He turned and walked away without looking back, and the sound of his footsteps thinned steadily into the noise of the morning until she could not separate them from everything else. Penelope stood on the pavement and breathed. Junho turned back to her. He looked at her cheek once, briefly. Then at her eyes. "Can you walk?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Steadier than she had any right to be. "Get in the car," he said. "I will take you up." Before we continue with the story, I would like to welcome you to my channel, Afro-Korean Mafia series by Jasmine. To everyone returning, welcome back, and to our new viewers, I'm glad you're here. Kindly like, subscribe, and join our growing community. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, because this story is only just getting started. The interior of the car was the quietest place Penelope had been in a long time. Dark leather. Half-raised partition. The noise of Seoul outside the windows reduced to something distant and irrelevant the moment the door closed. Junho sat on his side of the seat with a full deliberate distance between them and looked out his window at the city moving past. Penelope sat with her bag on her lap and her hands folded over it and her eyes on her own window. She pressed 2 fingers carefully to her cheekbone, and the pain flared sharp and immediate, and she dropped her hand back to her bag. Left panel, Junho said, without looking away from his window. There is a first aid kit. She found it. Small, navy blue, sitting exactly where he said it would be. She snapped the ice pack inside and pressed it to her cheek and exhaled slowly through her nose. From the corner of her eye, she saw him glance at her. Just once. Then he looked back out his window. The building arrived. The driver pulled around to the private side entrance. Junho stepped out and held the door. No ceremony in it, no performance of consideration, just the practical act of a man whose hand was on the door and who held it because she was coming through it. She stepped out onto the forecourt with the ice pack against her cheek and her bag back on her shoulder. "Thank you," she said, "for what happened back there." He looked at her with a directness she was already learning to recognize as his default setting. "Does he know where you live?" "Yes," she said. He nodded once and turned toward the entrance. In the elevator, they stood side by side without speaking. Penelope watched the floor numbers climb. She was aware of him beside her. The steadiness of him, the way his breathing had no current underneath it, no warning signal embedded in the rhythm. She noticed this the way you notice the absence of a sound you have been hearing for so long you forgot it was there. The doors opened at 14. Suwa was in the hallway. Yellow pajamas with small rabbits printed all over them. Dark hair sticking up on the left side. Both arms already extended toward Penelope before the elevator had fully opened. Her whole small body leaning forward with the impatience of a child who had been waiting since the moment she woke up. "Penny!" Penelope stepped out and bent down, and the impact of the small body hit her with the full committed force of someone who had been waiting and was done waiting. She pressed her face into Sua's hair and held on, and the child smelled like sleep and the lavender soap they used at bath time, and something underneath those things that was entirely and specifically her own particular warmth. "You are late," Suwa announced into Penelope's shoulder. "I know, baby. I am sorry." Suwa leaned back and looked at Penelope's face with the direct and completely unself-conscious attention that small children have not yet been taught to disguise. Her dark eyes moved to the swollen cheek. Her brow drew together in a way that looked far too old for her face. "You have an OE," she said. "I bumped it," Penelope said. "It is fine." Suwa held the look for one more second, measuring, unconvinced, and then turned to her father who stood just behind Penelope. "Appa," she said, with the grave seriousness of someone filing an official report. "Penny has an OE on her face." "I see it," Junho said. Looking at his daughter, something opened in his face that no other context in his life appeared to produce. Something completely unguarded, soft in a way his face was not soft in any other room. "Go get dressed. Mrs. Yoon made breakfast." Suwa considered the offer, grabbed Penelope's hand, and said, "Come with me." "Let Penny put her bag down first," Junho said. Suwa released the hand with a sigh of profound theatrical suffering and disappeared down the hallway. Penelope went to the staff room near the kitchen, set her bag down, stood in front of the small mirror. The swelling had climbed toward her eye. Deep purple at the center, yellowing at the outer edges. She applied arnica gel from her own bag, covered what she could, held her own gaze in the mirror for 3 seconds, and went back out. Junho was at the coffee machine. He set a cup on the counter near her side of the kitchen without a word. Then he turned and looked at her with the same complete attention he had given her on the pavement. "Starting tomorrow," he said. "Sungwoo collects you at 7:15. "That is really not." 7:15, he said, with the same tone and no additional explanation. She read his face. The conversation had concluded on his side before it began on hers. "Okay," she said. He picked up his own cup and moved toward his study. At the doorway, he stopped without turning around. "The ice pack," he said. 20 minutes tonight." The door closed. Penelope stood in the kitchen with both hands wrapped around her coffee cup and looked at the closed door and felt something sit in her chest that she was not going to examine right now. Suwa reappeared in a blue pinafore, hair in 2 uneven pigtails, holding out a hairbrush with the serene expectation of someone who has never once in her life been refused. "Fix it?" she asked. Penelope set her cup down. "Come here," she said. That night, Junho woke at 3 in the morning. He lay on his back in the dark and let the feeling of the dream pass through him the way water passes through a hand. Present for a moment, then gone, leaving only the warmth of having been there. He did not chase it. He never did. There was nothing specific enough to chase. No clear face, no identifiable place, only the feeling of someone beside him. The weight of a hand in his. A voice he recognized at a level below thought, in a place where recognition did not require a reason. He got up. He went to the kitchen and stood at the window with a glass of water and looked at Seoul spread out below. The Han River in the distance. The towers on the opposite bank. The city moving at its permanent low frequency in the dark. After a while he went back to bed. He did not think about it. He never allowed himself to follow that thread. He had learned across 3 years of the same dream, that following it led to a door that did not open. The treatment plan for Penelope's face was executed the following morning at the low table in the living room. Suah produced 4 drawings in careful sequence. A yellow sun with a face that was smiling very hard. A house with a blue door and curtained windows. A figure with long braids that she identified as Penelope, with a star above her head. A second figure with a dramatically large head and no visible neck, identified as Suah, also with a star, slightly larger. "This one is for making you feel better," Suah said, placing the sun drawing in front of Penelope with the gravity of someone delivering a medical prescription. "This one is because everyone needs a nice house." She placed the house drawing beside it with equal deliberateness. "You are completely right," Penelope said with total seriousness. Suah studied Penelope's cheek. "Does it still hurt?" "A little." "I will do another one," Suah said, pulling a fresh sheet of paper. Penelope watched the small hands moving the crayon across the page. Without thinking, her fingers found the pendant at her throat and held it for a moment. The small automatic habit of a hand that always knew where it was, always needed to confirm it was still there. She released it and looked back at Suah's drawing. "This is us at the park," Suah said, holding up the newest one. "Can we go this weekend?" Appa said maybe. "We can ask him," Penelope said. "Maybe means yes if I ask the right number of times," Suah said, with the considered skepticism of a child who had taken careful empirical notes on this subject. "Let us try once first," Penelope said. "Very nicely." Suah accepted this and went back to her drawing. Sung-woo was in the forecourt the next morning at exactly 7:15. Broad, solid mid-40s. The careful eyes of someone who had spent a professional lifetime watching the world without being watched back. He nodded once when Penelope came out and opened the back door of the car, and he said nothing further. She appreciated the complete absence of conversation. That evening Kyle was outside her building when Sung-woo pulled up. He stood against the wall beside the entrance with his arms crossed and his face composed into the reasonable expression. The one that said he was the patient one, the understanding one, the one who only wanted to talk. The expression that Penelope knew preceded the other one, the way a low sky preceded rain. Sung-woo parked the car at a deliberate angle. He stepped out first. He positioned his body between Penelope and the building entrance with the smooth economy of someone who had done this kind of thing before and found it unremarkable. He looked at Kyle. Kyle looked from Sung-woo to Penelope, who had stepped out with her key already between her fingers. "I only want to talk," Kyle said. "Not tonight," Penelope said. "Penny." She said not tonight, Sung-woo said. Kyle's eyes moved over Sung-woo with the measuring look of a man deciding the cost-benefit analysis of a physical barrier. Whatever he read in Sung-woo's particular stillness resolved the calculation quickly. "Fine," Kyle said, looking at Penelope. "Tomorrow." "You will not come here tomorrow," Sung-woo said. "Or the day after." "Who exactly are you?" Kyle asked. "Someone who will be here every day," Sung-woo said. Kyle stood there for a long moment with his jaw working. Then he pushed off the wall and walked away and turned the corner at the end of the street and was gone. Penelope let out the breath that had been sitting in her chest since Sung-woo stopped the car. "Go inside," Sung-woo said. "Lock the top bolt." She went inside and locked both bolts and sat on the edge of her bed in the quiet and looked at the wall. She placed her necklace on the nightstand the way she did every night, carefully, so the pendant rested flat. The gold caught the light from the window and held it. She had worn that necklace every single day for 9 years. Through 3 surgeries and 14 months of recovery in a Cape Town private clinic. Through the construction of an entirely new identity. Penelope Dlamini, assembled document by document, reference by reference, with the help of 2 people who had asked her nothing beyond what they needed to know to help her disappear properly. The necklace had been the one thing she woke up holding in that hospital, her hand wrapped around the chain while bandages covered everything else. And it was the one thing in those first terrible, confused days that told her she was still, underneath all the damage, the same person she had been before. She lay back and stared at the ceiling for a long time before sleep came. 3 weeks into the routine, on a Tuesday evening, Penelope was stacking Suah's drawings on the low table when Junho came out of his study. He stopped in the middle of the room. "Sit for a moment," he said. She sat at the far end of the sofa. He sat in the chair across from her. Not close, not crowding, the precise distance of a man who understood that closeness had to be earned in increments. He set his glass on the low table between them and looked at her directly. "Your family," he said. "Are they in Seoul?" "Durban," she said. "My mother. 2 sisters. You are close to them?" "We talk when we can." She paused. "The time difference makes it complicated." He held the answer for a moment, then asked, "Do you have people here?" "Friends." She thought about it honestly. "There was a woman I worked with at a previous position. We lost touch." She looked at her hands. "I have been fairly isolated since I arrived." He looked at her. He did not offer sympathy. He did not fill the space with reassurance. He simply absorbed the information the way he absorbed everything, quietly filing it somewhere precise. "Sungwoo is available to you during the day," he said. "Not only for collection and drop-off. If you need to go anywhere. If anything happens." She looked up. "I am not in danger," she said. "He is not going to." "He will," Junho said. "Men like that always return. When he does, Sungwoo will be close." She held his gaze and found no argument available that was honest, because he was right and she knew he was right, and arguing against something true was a habit she was trying to break. "Okay," she said. He reached for his glass and she noticed the thin silver scar on his left wrist. Old, barely there, catching the lamplight for a second before his sleeve shifted back. He did not adjust his sleeve. He did not hide it. "The park on Saturday," he said. "The 3 of us. Sua has been asking." "She mentioned it," Penelope said. "She mentioned it to me 4 times today," he said, using different approaches each time. He looked at his glass. "She is thorough." Penelope pressed her lips together to keep the smile contained. He saw it. He looked back at his glass and said nothing, but something at the corner of his mouth shifted by the smallest degree. She collected her jacket and moved to the elevator. At the door she turned because she felt his eyes on her back, and she was right. He was standing in the middle of the room with both hands in his pockets, looking at her with the expression that she had begun to notice he wore sometimes when he thought she was not looking. Something between recognition and confusion. The look of a man standing in front of a door he cannot explain the existence of. She stepped into the elevator. The doors closed between them. She was in the kitchen the following Wednesday morning, cutting fruit for Sua's breakfast, when Junho came in. He moved to the coffee machine on the other side of the counter. Normal. Routine. He did this every morning at this time. But this morning he did not immediately take his cup to his study. He stood at the counter with his coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the city below, and Penelope continued cutting the fruit, and the kitchen held the 2 of them in the ordinary morning quiet. Then he said, without turning around, "Sua was asking me something last night." Penelope's knife continued moving. "What was she asking?" "About your necklace," he said. "She wanted to know why you wear it every day." Penelope's knife slowed by half a second. She kept her eyes on the cutting board. "What did you tell her?" "I told her some things matter enough to keep close," he said. He turned then. He leaned back against the counter with his coffee cup in both hands and looked at her across the kitchen. His eyes went to the pendant at her throat, openly, directly, without pretending he was looking at something else. "What is it?" he asked. "The pendant." Penelope looked down at it briefly. "A crescent," she said. "I bought it at a market years ago. Cape Town." "Which market?" he asked. She looked up at him. His face was composed and still and completely unreadable. "One of the outdoor ones," she said. "Near the waterfront. I do not remember exactly which one." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once and picked up his coffee and walked to his study. The door closed. Penelope stood at the cutting board with the knife in her hand and did not move for 3 full seconds. She turned the pendant over with her free hand and looked at the back of it. The engraving was small and precise and impossible to read unless you were very close or you already knew it was there. She put the pendant back against her collarbone and went back to cutting the fruit. In his study, Junho sat down at his desk and placed his coffee cup to the side and did not open a single document. He sat very still and looked at the wall. He had commissioned a necklace once. A long time ago. A jeweler in Insadong. A man who worked only on private commissions, who had taken the sketch from Junho's own hand and studied it for a long time before he said yes. The crescent shape had been specific. The curve of it, the angle, the weight of the pendant. The engraving on the back had been 2 letters intertwined. Chosen by Junho himself, cut into the gold with a tool smaller than a pen, under a magnifying glass, while Junho watched. He sat at his desk and thought about all of this very carefully. Then he picked up his phone and sent Sungwoo a message. "I need the name of the jeweler on Insadong who does private commissions. The one I used 11 years ago. Find him." He set the phone down and picked up the documents in front of him and made himself red. Saturday came with clear skies and mild air. Suwa was at the front door in her yellow coat 20 minutes before they were supposed to leave. Snack bag gripped in both hands with the focused energy of someone who had been preparing for this operation since Thursday. They walked to the park together, Suwa between them, narrating everything. A man doing slow morning exercises near the park entrance. A woman power walking with earphones in who Suwa felt was going too fast and said so. 2 pigeons near the path that Suwa assessed with the critical eye of a documentarian. A dog appeared within 4 minutes. A large, gentle animal whose owner. A man in his 60s with a paper coffee cup and the relaxed demeanor of someone with nowhere to be, allowed the introduction. Suwa crouched and greeted the dog with the solemn formality of someone conducting an important diplomatic meeting. Penelope crouched beside her to prevent the very real possibility of Suwa pitching forward in her enthusiasm. Junho stood just behind them. He looked at the back of Penelope's neck. She had her braids pinned up because of the warmth, and the nape of her neck was fully visible. At the base of her hairline on the right side there was a small mark, irregular in shape, slightly darker than the surrounding skin, the kind of permanent mark a person is born with and carries without ever thinking about. He looked at it for 2 full seconds. Then he looked away. Then he looked back. Something moved through him that he could not locate or name. It was not a thought. It was more like standing in the dark and feeling the temperature change. Unable to see the source, unable to explain the shift, but certain that something had changed in the air around him. He looked away from the mark and fixed his eyes on the distance. Suwa stood up and grabbed both their hands at the same moment, her right hand finding Penelope's left, her left hand finding her father's, and pulled them forward toward the fountain she had been announcing since they entered the park. Junho walked because his daughter was pulling him, and because standing still would require an explanation he did not have. Suwa released them at the fountain and ran the last few meters. They stopped side by side, close in the way that happens when a child releases 2 hands at once, and the natural physics of the moment brings 2 people together in the space she left. The sound of the water was just ahead. The mild autumn air moved around them. He looked at her profile. She was watching Suwa with her arms loosely crossed, her head tilted slightly to the left, the corner of her mouth curved at whatever Suwa was doing at the edge of the fountain. The pendant rested at her collarbone on its thin chain, catching the light when she breathed. He looked at the pendant, then at her profile, then back at the pendant. "Appa, do you have a coin?" Suwa called. He reached into his pocket without looking away from the pendant for 1 moment longer. Then he walked forward and placed the coin in his daughter's outstretched hands. That evening, after Sungwoo had taken Penelope home, Junho sat in his study and called the jeweler. The man remembered him. Of course he remembered. Private commissions at that level did not come often, and they did not come forgettably. "The crescent piece," Junho said. "The one with the engraving on the back. Tell me about the design specifications." The jeweler described them. The exact angle of the crescent curve. The weight distribution. The way the chain connected at the upper point rather than the lower, which was unusual and had been Junho's specific request. The engraving, 2 letters intertwined, cut by hand. "Was there only one made?" Junho asked. "Only one," the jeweler said. "You were very specific about that. You wanted it to be the only one that existed." Junho thanked him and ended the call. He sat in the quiet of his study for a long time. The necklace Penelope wore every day, the one she had told him she bought at an outdoor market in Cape Town, had a crescent at the exact angle he had sketched himself 11 years ago, connected at the upper point, the only one of its kind. He picked up his phone again. He called Director O. Meanwhile, 3 floors below in the building lobby, Sungwoo was walking back to the car after seeing Penelope out when his phone buzzed with a message from Junho. The message contained 1 name and 1 instruction. The name was the building's weekend security coordinator, a man named Bae Tae-young who had been working the Saturday desk for 2 years. The instruction was to find out whether Bae Tae-young had spoken to anyone outside the building about residence or household arrangements in the past month. Sungwoo ran the check overnight. By Sunday morning, he had the answer. Bae Tae-young had accepted money from a man matching Kyle's description 6 weeks ago. He had provided the general information that the household on 14 sometimes used a private property for extended stays when the family needed privacy. He had not known the specific location, but he had known enough for Kyle to start looking. Sungwoo delivered this information to Junho on Sunday morning. Junho read it. He set the report down on his desk. He picked up his phone and called the building management company. "Bae Tae-young," he said when the manager answered. "He is to be removed from his position today. Not reassigned. Removed. If he contests it, send the documentation to my legal team. He ended the call and went to have breakfast with his daughter. He did not mention it to Penelope. But Sungwoo noticed that from that Sunday forward, Junho stood at the window when Penelope arrived in the mornings, just for those 30 seconds while she crossed the forecourt from the car to the entrance, and he did not move away from the window until she was inside. Kyle came back on a Tuesday. He did not come to the building this time. He was smarter than that now. He understood that the building had a guardian he could not simply wait out. Instead, he found her at the small convenience store 2 streets away, where she had stopped on her lunch break to buy Suwa, a particular juice that the child had decided was the only acceptable juice. Sungwoo was in the car outside. Kyle appeared at her shoulder in the narrow aisle between the refrigerators. "You have me blocked," he said, his voice low, eyes on the refrigerator in front of them, as though they were 2 strangers studying the same drink selection. "Every number." Penelope took the juice from the shelf. "Yes," she said. "That is a childish way to handle things." She moved toward the counter. He moved with her. "You embarrassed me," he said, keeping his voice pleasant. The pleasantness was the most familiar and the most dangerous thing about him. "In front of whoever that man is. You let him speak to me like that." "I need you to leave me alone," she said. His hand closed around her wrist. Not violently. That was never how it started. Just firm. Just the grip of a man communicating that she was not going anywhere until he decided she was. The convenience store attendant behind the counter was looking at his phone. Then the door of the convenience store opened and Sungwoo walked in. Kyle released her wrist before Sungwoo was close enough to see the grip. He stepped back. He smiled. "Think carefully about what you are doing," he said quietly to Penelope and walked out. Penelope stood at the counter with her wrist against her stomach. Sungwoo stopped beside her. He looked at her wrist. He looked at the door Kyle had just walked through. "He touched you," Sungwoo said. "My wrist," she said. He grabbed my wrist. Sungwoo took out his phone. "Sungwoo, Mr. Seo will want to know," he said. She did not argue further. She paid for the juice and went back to the car. That evening, after Suwa was asleep and Penelope had gone home, Junho got into his car. He had Kyle's workplace address from the background file Sungwoo had compiled weeks ago. He had known for 5 weeks that Kyle worked at a mid-sized import logistics firm in Uedo. He had known for 4 weeks that the firm's parent company was a subsidiary of a holding group. He had known for 3 weeks that he owned 38% of that holding group and held 2 board seats. He had not used this information until tonight. He arrived at the building at 8:15. The firm worked late. Kyle was still at his desk on the 6th floor when the receptionist, who had been called ahead by someone from Junho's office, showed him to the small conference room near the elevator bank. Kyle walked in expecting a client meeting. He walked in and saw Junho sitting at the head of the conference table with a single folder in front of him and his hands folded on top of it, and the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he was always going to arrive and is simply allowing the other person to catch up to this fact. Kyle stopped. He looked at Junho. He looked at the room. He looked at the receptionist, who closed the door quietly from the outside. Kyle sat down slowly at the opposite end of the table. "You know who I am," Junho said. It was not a question. "You are the man from the pavement," Kyle said carefully. "I am Seo Junho," he said. He opened the folder in front of him and turned it so Kyle could read the top document. "I own 38% of Daesong Holdings. Daesong Holdings owns Meridian Logistics Group. Meridian Logistics Group is the parent company of the firm you have been employed by for the past 2 years." Kyle looked at the document, then at Junho's face, then back at the document. The color did not drain from Kyle's face all at once. It went slowly, starting at the edges, the way something expensive breaks, in stages, each one worse than the last. "Every salary deposit you have received for 2 years," Junho said, in the same even tone he had used for every other sentence, "came from a payroll system that exists within my ownership structure. The contract you signed on your first day contains a standard conduct clause in Section 14, Paragraph 3. I had my legal team review it this afternoon." He paused. "You are in breach." Kyle said nothing. His jaw was very tight. "Your access card will be deactivated at midnight tonight," Junho said. "A termination letter will be processed by HR tomorrow morning. You will not be eligible for a reference." He closed the folder. "You will also find that your work authorization renewal, which I understand is due in 6 weeks, has encountered a complication at the processing stage." Kyle looked at him. "You cannot." "I already have," Junho said. He stood up. He picked up the folder. He looked at Kyle one final time from the end of the conference table. "She told you to leave her alone," he said. You put your hand on her wrist today anyway. He held the look for 2 seconds. If you make contact with her again, through any channel, in any form, the legal file my team has prepared goes to the prosecutor's office. Medical records. Photographs. A testimony from a previous partner who filed a protection order in Cape Town 3 years ago. Kyle's mouth opened. She deserves better than what you gave her, Junho said. And you deserve exactly what is coming. He walked to the door, opened it, and left. Kyle sat alone in the conference room and looked at the closed door for a long time. He did not come back. Not to the building. Not to the convenience store. Not to the street outside Penelope's apartment. He disappeared from her life with the completeness of a man who had run his own calculation and arrived at a result he could not argue with. Penelope noticed his absence the way you notice when a sound you have stopped hearing was present. In its removal, suddenly understanding how much space it had been taking up. She did not ask what had happened. She looked at Junho one morning across the kitchen counter, and he looked back at her, and she understood that the question had already been answered, and the answer was thorough and final. "Thank you," she said quietly. He set her coffee on the counter in front of her. 7:15 tomorrow, he said. Sung-woo will be outside. That was all. She picked up her coffee and went to find Suah. The cold came the following week. Suah carried it in with the cheerful efficiency of a 4-year-old who had no concept of quarantine and no interest in acquiring one. Penelope managed 2 full days of it. Fever, congestion, the magnificent unwillingness to remain horizontal. She kept Suah comfortable and entertained, and gradually, incrementally, more horizontal as each afternoon progressed. On the 3rd day, the cold had a new host. Penelope came in on Wednesday visibly unwell. She did her hair. She greeted Suah at the elevator with the same warmth she always brought. She went to the kitchen and began making breakfast with the focused determination of someone who has decided that being sick is not a sufficient reason to change the schedule. Junho came into the kitchen at 8:30. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at her, one long careful look, starting at her face and ending at the set of her shoulders. "Go to the guest room," he said. "I am fine," she said, not turning around. "You are not fine," he said. "Go to the guest room. I have Suah." She put the spatula down and went. She lay on the guest room bed and listened to the apartment. Suah's voice carrying down the hallway at its normal, unstoppable pace. Junho answering, brief, patient, specific. Suah asking something that made him go quiet for a moment before answering, which meant she had asked something that required a real answer. The sounds of breakfast being made by someone who was doing it with deliberate attention rather than habit. 2 hours later, there was a knock at the guest room door. She said, "Come in." The door opened. Junho set a tray on the table beside the bed. A bowl of doenjangjigi still steaming. A glass of water. 2 tablets in a small ceramic dish. He straightened up. He looked at her face, at the fever-bright eyes and the tightness around her mouth, and something moved in his expression that he did not try to hide. Then he left without saying anything. Penelope sat up and looked at the tray. The soup was still hot. He had timed it so it would still be hot when he brought it in. She picked up the spoon and her eyes burned briefly, and it was not from the fever. She came out 2 hours later and found him in the kitchen with Suah. Drawing together at the low counter, Suah providing detailed and authoritative critique. "The fishtail is wrong, Appa." "The fishtail is abstract," he said without looking up. "It is wrong," Suah said with the certainty of a senior academic. "Eat your crackers." Suah picked up a crayon and reached over and began correcting the drawing herself. He moved his hand out of the way without protest and watched her work with an expression that was completely open and completely unaware that it was open. Penelope stood in the doorway and watched the two of them and felt something pull tight in the center of her chest. Something that had been building for months in small increments and had just pulled a little tighter than she was prepared for. She went back to the guest room before either of them saw her. The jealousy moment happened on a Thursday evening 3 weeks later. Junho had a business dinner, one of the legitimate world obligations that required his physical presence and his managed public face. He brought Penelope because Suah had refused to stay with Mrs. Yoon and had staged what Junho described, without expression, as a significant protest, and the practical solution was to bring them both and let Suah sit with Penelope at the adjacent table while he handled the business portion of the evening. The restaurant was the kind that did not have prices on the menu. Penelope sat with Suah at a small table near the window while Junho sat with 3 men at the main table 12 feet away. She could see him in her peripheral vision, controlled, precise, commanding the room without appearing to try. A woman approached his table at the midpoint of the evening. She was impeccably dressed, clearly known to one of the other men, introduced to Junho with the particular warmth of an introduction being made with a specific intention. She was beautiful and polished, and she laughed at something Junho said and placed her hand briefly on his arm. Penelope cut Sua's food into smaller pieces with very precise and careful cuts. Sua looked at the food, then at Penelope's face. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I am completely fine," Penelope said. "Eat your dinner." Sua ate her dinner. Penelope did not look at the main table. She looked at the window. She looked at Sua. She looked at her own plate. She did not look at the main table. 15 minutes later, the business portion of the evening wrapped, and Junho came to their table. He sat down across from Penelope. He looked at her face, that 2-second read he had been developing for months, and something shifted behind his eyes. He said nothing about it. But when the woman came by to say goodbye to the table as the party broke up, she stopped beside Junho and said it had been a pleasure, and perhaps they would see each other at the Hanam event next month. And Junho looked at her with the same composed and polite distance he used for every professional interaction, and said he was afraid his schedule was quite committed these days. And he turned his attention back to the table. Back to Penelope. Back to Sua. The woman left. Penelope looked at her plate. Junho said to the table in general, "Sua, you have sauce on your chin," and reached across with a napkin, and Sua submitted to this with the expression of someone enduring a minor indignity. And when Junho sat back, his eyes went to Penelope briefly, and the corner of his mouth moved by the smallest and most controlled degree. She looked at her plate, but the tightness in her chest from earlier in the evening had changed its quality entirely. It no longer felt like something wrong. It felt like something she could not continue pretending was not there. The files from Director O arrived on a Monday morning, 2 weeks after Junho had made the call. He read them alone at his desk before anyone arrived in the apartment. He read the original accident report from the coastal road outside Busan. 3 pages, compared to the 1-page official version. The 2 missing pages contained the witness statement of a driver who had seen a second vehicle deliberately accelerate into the first car on a stretch of road with no cameras and no other witnesses. The witness statement had been collected and then removed from the official record. The officer whose signature appeared on the original had retired 6 months after the incident on a pension significantly larger than his rank should have produced. He read the Cape Town hospital file. A private clinic in the southern suburbs. A patient admitted 9 days after the Busan accident date. Unconscious on admission. No identification. Arranged transport paid for by a third party whose name appeared once in the intake paperwork and was not a name Junho recognized, but whose payment method, when traced by Director O's investigator, connected back through 2 shell accounts to a financial channel he recognized very well. A channel his mother had used for private arrangements for 20 years. The surgical notes covered 3 procedures over 14 months. The post-operative photographs showed a face that shared no visible features with the pre-operative photographs. The reconstruction was complete. It was done by someone very skilled, someone paid very well to do thorough work and ask no questions. He turned the page. The obstetric notes were attached separately. A single folded sheet clipped to the back of the surgical file, as though whoever had assembled the package had debated whether to include it and decided at the last moment that it was necessary. Naledi had been 14 weeks pregnant at the time of the accident. He set the page down. He picked it up again. 14 weeks. The pregnancy had not been visible. He had not known. She had not yet told him. The note from the attending physician stated that the patient had been stabilized and the pregnancy monitored throughout the recovery period. The delivery had taken place 7 months after admission. A full-term birth, healthy, a girl, 3.2 kilograms. The delivery notes listed the attending physician, the date, the time, the weight. The line below the delivery notes read, "Infant transferred to private transport arranged by third party on day 4 postpartum. Patient was under sedation for post-surgical procedure at time of transfer. Patient was not consulted." He read that line 3 times. Patient was not consulted. His mother had been in Cape Town. Or someone acting directly for his mother had been in Cape Town. Monitoring the situation. Waiting. When Naledi delivered, when she was sedated and could not object and could not fight and could not even know what was happening in the room next door. Someone had walked into that clinic and taken his daughter and put her on a plane to Seoul. He had been sitting in his apartment in Seoul 3 weeks later when Sungwoo knocked on his study door and told him there was a woman downstairs. A representative, she said, from a private intermediary, and that she had something that belonged to him. He had gone downstairs. There was a baby and a carrier on the lobby table. His mother had called him that evening. She had said, in the composed and measured tone she used for everything, that she had arranged for the child to be brought home. That Nality was gone, and the child was his, and Soul was where she belonged. That she had done what needed to be done, because he was not in a state to do it himself. He had believed her. He had picked up his daughter, and he had believed every word his mother said, because he was grieving, and the baby was real and warm and present, and the grief needed somewhere to go. He sat at his desk now and looked at the delivery note. Patient was not consulted. Nality had woken up from surgery in that Cape Town clinic, and her daughter was already gone. She had survived a murder attempt and delivered a baby alone with no identity and no documentation, and no one she knew in the room, and then she had woken up, and the baby was not there either. He closed the file. He placed both hands flat on the desk and looked at the wall and breathed very carefully for a long time. He let the morning run normally. Suwa at the elevator. Breakfast. Letters practice at the low table. A debate about whether clouds were made of water that had been ongoing since Tuesday and showed no signs of resolution. At 11, when Suwa was settled with her program and the apartment was quiet, Junho came out of his study and stood in the kitchen doorway. Penelope was at the counter preparing Suwa's lunch. "Suwa," he said, "go and watch your program for 20 minutes." Suwa looked between the two adults with the brief, accurate assessment of a child reading the temperature of a room, and then she slid off her stool and went without argument. Junho came into the kitchen. Penelope continued preparing the lunch. She picked up the knife and began cutting the apple into the careful segments Suwa preferred. "Put it down," he said. She set the knife on the cutting board. She turned and faced him. He was standing close, closer than the usual kitchen distance, 3 feet rather than 6. His arms were at his sides. His face was composed. His eyes had the quality she had been watching develop for weeks. Not the professional distance he used for the rest of the world, but the deep, focused, particular attention that saw past the surface of things. "Tell me about the accident," he said. The knife was on the cutting board. The apple was half cut. The kitchen was very quiet. Penelope looked at him. He looked at her. "The coastal road outside Busan," he said. 9 years ago. October. In the living room, Sua's program played on at its normal cheerful volume. Somewhere outside, a delivery truck beeped twice as it backed up. The Han River was visible in the far distance through the kitchen window, moving the way it always moved, indifferent to everything happening in the apartment above it. "Junho," she said. His name in her mouth landed in him at a level below thought. She watched it happen, the fractional shift in his face, the way his jaw moved slightly, the recognition in his eyes of something he could not have explained but could not deny. "How long?" he said. "How long have you been in this apartment knowing who I am?" 8 months, she said. "You came back to Seoul before that?" "Yes." "For Suwa?" "Yes." Her hand pressed flat on the counter beside the cutting board. "I came back for Suwa. I found the agency. I arranged the interview." "You arranged it deliberately," he said. "Yes." He held her gaze. "My mother," he said. She looked at him for a long time. She had waited 8 months for this moment, and she had rehearsed it in her head across 8 months of mornings in this kitchen, and none of the rehearsals had felt like this. Standing in front of him in the actual room with the actual light coming through the actual window with Sua's program playing down the hall. "Yes," she said. He turned away from her. He faced the kitchen window with both hands flat on the counter and stood there with his back to her and the city spread out below him. His shoulder blades were tight under his jacket. She could see the tension across his back, the only place it showed because everywhere else he had perfect control of it. She told him everything. The car that came from behind on the coastal road. Not drifting, not losing control, but accelerating deliberately into the driver's side on a wet road with no barriers on the ocean edge. The impact. The barrier giving way. The fall. The dark water coming in through the broken window, very cold, very fast. The darkness after that, which lasted a long time. She told him about waking up in Cape Town with her face wrapped in bandages and her hands wrapped in bandages in one hand. She must have held it through everything, through the water and the dark and the ambulance she did not remember, still wrapped around the chain of the necklace at her throat. A nurse she had never seen before sitting beside the bed. The nurse told her she had been in a medically induced sleep for 6 days. She told her she was in South Africa. She told her that her transport and care had been arranged and paid for by a private party, and she did not have the name of that party. She told him about the surgeries. 3 of them. The surgeon was careful and specific, and after the second surgery, he told her honestly that when the reconstruction was complete, no one who had known her face before would recognize it. She had lain in the recovery room and stared at the ceiling and understood what that meant. Whoever had arranged the accident had arranged it to be final. The fact that she was alive was not part of their plan. The new face was her only advantage, the one thing they had not anticipated. She told him about building Penelope Dlamini from nothing. Documentation and work history and references constructed piece by piece with the help of two people who had owed her a debt from before, who asked no questions and expected nothing in return except that she stay safe and stay disappeared. She told him about coming back to Seoul. 3 years of watching from a distance first. Learning the shape of Sua's life, the school she attended, the park she visited on Saturdays. Finding the agency. Walking into the interview and seeing her daughter for the first time since she was 3 months old and not being allowed to show a single thing on her face that was not professional warmth and competence. She told him that she had not known, walking into this apartment for the first time, whether the grief Sung-woo had once mentioned, just once quietly in passing, was real or performed. She had not known whether Junho had been part of what his mother had done. She had needed to watch him. She had needed 8 months of watching him with his daughter and with his people, and in the quiet of those evening conversations, before she was certain enough. When she finished, she was still standing at the counter with her hand flat on the surface and her eyes on his back. He stood at the window and did not speak. The tension across his shoulders had not eased. His hands were still flat on the counter. The Han River moved in the distance, indifferent, and the kitchen was completely quiet. "She told me you were dead," he said. His voice was completely level. The levelness was more precise and more controlled than anything loud would have been. "She stood in front of me and told me you were dead, and she watched me grieve you." "I know," Penelope said. "I grieved you for years." "I know." He turned around. He looked at her across the kitchen with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the controlled public face, not the soft private face he wore for Sua. Something completely stripped of management. Something that had been under everything else for 9 years and had just come to the surface because there was no longer any reason to hold it down. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he said. "When you came back. When you found Sua." "Because I did not know if you knew," she said. "And I could not afford to be wrong." He held her gaze. He breathed. He looked at her face, really looked, the way he had been careful not to look across 8 months of close proximity, as though full attention was something he had been rationing because he did not trust what it would show him. "Go and be with Sua," he said. His voice was measured. Careful. The voice of a man who needs to be alone with something enormous before he can handle it safely in front of another person. She went. He drove to Hanamdong alone. He did not call ahead. He arrived at the house at 2 in the afternoon and walked through the front door without ringing and found his mother in the formal receiving room. The room with the high-backed chairs and the correct lighting that she had always used for conversations she intended to control. She was sitting with tea and a document she set aside when he came in, composed and unsurprised, the expression of a woman who had been expecting this visit and had prepared for it. He sat down across from her and placed the folder from Director O on the table between them. "Read it," he said. She did not touch the folder immediately. "Whatever you think you have found." "Read it," he said. She looked at him. Then she looked at the folder. She opened it and read slowly. The accident report first, then the hospital file, then the obstetric notes, then the delivery note with its single line at the bottom. Patient was not consulted. She read that line and did not react and closed the folder and placed her hands in her lap and looked at him with the composed expression of a woman whose face had been trained across 40 years not to betray her. "Everything I did," she said, "I did for this family." He looked at her across the table for a long moment. "You tried to kill her," he said. "You paid someone to run her off a coastal road on a wet night with no barriers on the ocean side. You arranged for her to be transported unconscious to another country and rebuilt surgically so that if she survived, which you did not plan for, she could not come back to the life she had. You watched her deliver your grandchild alone in a foreign clinic with no one she knew in the room. You waited until she was sedated from surgery and you sent someone to take the baby. You brought the baby to Seoul and you handed her to me and you stood in front of me and told me her mother was dead." He held her gaze. "And then you watched me raise that child for 4 years knowing that her mother was alive and had woken up in that clinic and found her gone." Madame Seo said nothing. "She spent 3 years watching from a distance," he said. "She could not come back as herself because you made sure there was no self to come back as. She arranged a job interview. She walked into my apartment and she saw her daughter for the first time in 4 years, and she was not allowed to show a single thing on her face because she did not yet know whether I was part of what you had done." He stopped. "Sua reached for her hand on the first day. Did you know that?" Your granddaughter found her mother by instinct in a room full of strangers because some part of a 4-year-old child knew what your arrangements could not erase. His mother's composure held. It had always held. It was the one thing she had that nothing had ever broken. She was not suitable, Madame Co said. Everything I did was calculated to protect what this family has built. You would have thrown all of it away for a woman who... I am going to stop you there, he said. His voice had not changed. It had not risen. It had not sharpened. It was the same even tone he had used for every sentence in this room, and that was more precise and more final than anything loud would have been. The criminal submission has already been filed, he said. This morning, before I drove here. An independent firm that does not work for me and cannot be influenced by anything you have access to filed attempted murder and criminal conspiracy charges with the prosecutor's office at 9:15 this morning. The documentation is complete. The obstetric notes are included. The delivery transfer record is included. The payment trail connecting your financial channel to the clinic transport is included. The witness statement from the coastal road that was removed from the official accident report is included. His mother looked at him. The prosecutor's office will move slowly, he said. Your legal team is expensive and cases like this take time. But they will move. And while they move, this is what is already in effect as of this morning. He opened the second folder. Thinner, domestic, the kind of document that did not require Director O to produce. You have been removed from every position you hold in the family's business operations. Every account, every contact, every board seat, every operational element. As of 9 this morning, you have no access to any of it. The legal transfer documentation has been witnessed and filed. She looked at the folder. For the first time, her composure showed something at the edges. Not fear, not remorse, but the specific expression of a woman who has just understood the full dimensions of what is being taken from her. The Hannum property will be monitored, he said. A security detail is being placed there today. They are not there for your protection. They are there to enforce the conditions. You will not leave the property without notification. You will not contact Nality. You will not contact anyone in my household. You will not contact Sua. You will not contact anyone in the organization. He paused. If you violate any condition, the prosecutor's office will be notified immediately, and your legal team will no longer have the option of a negotiated outcome. You are taking everything, she said. Her voice was still composed. But underneath the composition, something had shifted. The voice of a woman who has built her entire life around a single currency and is watching it disappear. She woke up in a clinic in Cape Town, he said, with no face and no name and no baby and no way home. You took everything from her first. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. He picked up both folders. I will not be coming here again, he said. Sua will not be coming here. When she is old enough to make her own decision about whether she wants a relationship with you, she will make it herself, and I will not influence it either way. But she will make it knowing the full truth of what you did. I will make certain of that. He looked at his mother one final time across the formal room. The high-backed chairs, the correct lighting, the room she had always used to control the conversations that mattered. I spent 9 years grieving a woman who was alive, he said. Sua spent 4 years without her mother because you decided your preferences mattered more than her life. There is no version of what you did that this family recovers from. There is only what comes after it. He left. He drove back across the river and went home to his family. Sung-woo, in the front seat, said nothing either. He had known Junho for 11 years. He drove. The rain came 3 days later. It arrived in the early evening without warning. A heavy, committed autumn rain that drove against the windows of the 14th floor in continuous gray sheets and turned the streets below into shallow rivers. Penelope had stayed late because Sua had woken from her afternoon nap with a fever, and they had spent the hours since managing it together. And by the time the child's temperature had come down to something reasonable and her breathing had deepened into genuine sleep, it was past 8 and the rain had not eased. Junho appeared in the doorway of Sua's room. He looked at his daughter first, then at Penelope, sitting in the small chair beside the bed with her hand resting near Sua's on the blanket. Then at the window. Sungwoo cannot get through, he said quietly. The underpass near your building is flooded. The bus routes through Mapo have been suspended. Penelope looked at the window. The rain was a solid moving wall against the glass. Stay, he said. Guest room. She looked at him. In the dim light of Sua's room, with the rain coming down outside, and the child sleeping between them, and everything that had been said in the kitchen 3 days ago still sitting in the air of the apartment like a changed temperature, the word stay landed differently than it would have landed 4 months ago. She nodded. She checked Sua one more time. cool enough, breathing evenly, the stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. And then she went to the kitchen and put the kettle on because she needed something to do with her hands. Junho came in 10 minutes later. He sat at the counter. She made 2 cups of tea and placed one in front of him and sat on the other side. They held their cups and the rain drove against the windows and the apartment was warm and completely quiet except for the sound of the rain. He looked at her across the counter. She looked at her cup. "I spoke to my mother," he said. She looked up. "I sat across from her in that room she uses for difficult conversations," he said. I put the files in front of her. The accident report. The hospital record. The payment trail. He held his cup. She said everything she did was done for this family. Penelope looked at his face. "What happens to her?" she asked. "She has lost everything she actually cared about," he said. "Her position. Her authority. Her access to everything she spent 40 years building." He set his cup down. "She is under house restriction with a security detail enforcing it. If she violates the conditions, the criminal submission goes in." "Is that enough?" Penelope asked. He looked at her for a moment. "For you," he said. "Or for me?" She held his gaze. "Both." He was quiet. "No," he said honestly. "It is not enough. But it is what the law will sustain, and it is what I can make permanent. A prison sentence she could contest and reduce. This," he looked at his hands, "this she cannot get back from. Ever." The rain pressed harder against the glass. The city outside had disappeared behind water. He stood up from his stool. He came around the counter. She did not move back. He stopped in front of her, close, the closest he had stood to her in 8 months of shared space. Close enough that she could see the specific quality of his attention, which had no management in it at all right now, none of the careful professional control that ran everything else. Just him. Just this. His hand came up slowly. He touched the pendant at her throat. 2 fingers, gentle, lifting it slightly from her collarbone and turning it over. He read the back of it. His thumb moved over the engraving once. He looked up at her face. "I made this," he said. 11 years ago. I took a sketch to a jeweler in Insadong, and I watched him cut these letters into the gold." He held her gaze. "I gave it to a woman I was going to marry." Penelope's breath was very steady. She was making it very steady. "The jeweler confirmed for me 2 weeks ago that only one was ever made," Junho said. "That it could only have come from one place." He did not release the pendant. "I need you to tell me the truth. Not the market in Cape Town. The truth." She looked at him for a long time. "Nality," she said. Her name. Her real name. The one she had not said aloud in 9 years. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, she was still there, right in front of him, and the pendant was still in his fingers, and the rain was still coming down, and Suwa was asleep down the hallway, and 9 years were sitting in the kitchen with both of them, and they were going to have to decide what to do with 9 years. "I have been falling in love with you," he said. "For months. While I believed I was somehow betraying someone I had lost." His voice was low and completely even. "And then I understood that they were the same person. That there was never any betrayal. That it was always you." She looked at his face. At the scar on his wrist that she had noticed on the 3rd evening and never asked about. At the line of his jaw and the particular quality of his eyes when he was not managing what they showed. At the man she had watched for 8 months from a careful distance and had been falling toward for longer than 8 months. Longer than 9 years, falling toward him since before the accident and during it and after it, and across every mile and every surgery and every document she had assembled to become someone else. "Junho," she said. He leaned forward. His forehead came to rest against hers. They stayed like that for a moment. His forehead against hers and the pendant between them and the rain coming down outside and everything else suspended. "Can I?" he said. "Yes," she said. Before he finished. Before he needed to finish. He kissed her. Slowly, the way a person moves towards something they have been afraid to want and have stopped being afraid. His hands came up to her face, careful, so careful, cupping her face as though she was something that had survived a great deal and deserved to be handled with the full knowledge of that. She put both hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat under her palms, steady, controlled almost. Almost steady. She leaned into him. He held her. The rain drove against the windows of the 14th floor, and the city below was all water, and the kitchen was warm, and the kiss lasted as long as it needed to last, which was long. He pulled back. He looked at her face in the kitchen light. He picked her up, one arm under her knees, one at her back, and she made a soft sound against his shoulder, surprised. And he carried her through the quiet apartment to the guest room and set her down at the door and stepped back and looked at her. "Rest," he said. His voice had changed quality. "Not much. Enough." She stood at the door and looked at him standing in the hallway. "Good night, Junho," she said. "Good night, Nality," he said. Her name. Her real name. In his voice, the way he had always said it, the specific sound of it that no one else had ever produced. It sat in the center of her chest and radiated warmth outward in every direction. She closed the door. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he walked back down the hallway to his own room, and the dream, when it came, had a face in it for the first time in 3 years. The weeks that followed changed the shape of everything. Junho did not suddenly become someone different. He was still precise, still controlled, still the man who ran an organization that required absolute authority and did not tolerate imprecision. But in the apartment, in the specific geography of the 14th floor, things shifted in ways that were small and specific and completely impossible to miss if you were paying attention. He started coming to the kitchen before she arrived in the mornings. He stood at the coffee machine, and when she came off the elevator with Suwa attached to her hand, his eyes went to her face immediately, and something in his expression settled. The specific settling of a man whose internal calculation has just completed and returned the result he was hoping for. He handed her coffee across the counter with his hand facing up, the cup resting in his palm, so she had to reach toward him slightly to take it. The first time she did this, their fingers touched on the transfer, and neither of them moved for half a second before she took the cup and said thank you and looked away. He stood closer than he used to. Not crowding. Not obvious. Just present in whatever part of the room she was in, gravitationally, the way things with weight moved toward each other without being directed to. Suwa noticed. Suwa noticed in the way children notice things, without being able to articulate it, but with the infallible accuracy of someone who has been reading the temperature of rooms since before she could name temperatures. She started drawing pictures that featured 3 people consistently. A tall figure, a figure with long braids, a small figure with a very large head, all 3 in the same picture, all 3 with stars. She showed one of these pictures to Penelope on a Thursday morning and said, "This is our family." Penelope looked at the drawing for a moment. "It is a beautiful drawing," she said. "I know," Suwa said with complete serenity, and went back to her crayons. The Incheon problem announced itself fully on a Tuesday evening. The operating license for Junho's logistics company was frozen by the city authority without warning. His legal team confirmed within an hour that the documentation discrepancy cited as the reason for the freeze did not exist. It had been created. He spent 4 days tracing the chain backward. It ended in Incheon. The syndicate had been applying methodical pressure for 5 months. Not force, because force was something he could answer directly. Erosion. Small targeted pressures designed to accumulate into a reactive mistake. 2 licensed businesses hit with regulatory complications from officials who had been quietly purchased. A supply chain disrupted at the source. The pattern of a patient organization that wanted him off balance before a direct confrontation. He identified Park Hyun-suk as the internal source within a week. 7 years in the organization. Senior enough to have the access that the Incheon group had been using. Junho changed a supply route at the last minute on instinct alone. The interception hit the original route and found nothing. He met Hyun-suk in a room in the industrial district south of the river. 1 table. 2 chairs. No windows. The meeting lasted 45 minutes. Hyun-suk resigned that evening and was on a flight out of Incheon Airport by the following morning. Then Junho turned to the Incheon group itself. He did not call them. He did not send a message. He sent Sung-woo to a meeting that the Incheon group had scheduled with one of their subsidiary managers. A meeting that Junho's intelligence had known about for 2 weeks. Sung-woo sat down at the table in the manager's place and placed a single card in the center of the table with Junho's private number on it. On the back of the card was written, "He is available tomorrow. 1 meeting. Terms to be finalized. There will not be a second invitation." They called within the hour. The meeting was held on a Friday in a private room at a Uedo hotel. Junho arrived 7 minutes late, not by accident. He sat at the head of the table and looked at the 3 men across from him and spent the first 4 minutes saying nothing. Just looking at them. Letting the silence do what silence did in the presence of a man who was comfortable in it, and they were not. Then he laid out the terms. The meeting lasted 3 hours. The terms were accepted. The licensing complications on his businesses were withdrawn by end of day. The supply chain disruption stopped. The territorial boundaries were formally documented. Near the end of the meeting, one of the 3 men made a casual reference to the childcare arrangement at the 14th floor. He said it pleasantly, watching Junho's face. Junho's face gave him nothing. The household arrangements are standard and unremarkable, Junho said, in the same tone he had used for every term of the negotiation. I would focus on the compliance schedule for the Eastern Boundary documentation. That is due in 10 days. The man looked at the table and wrote something down. After the meeting, in the car on the way back across the river, Junho called Sung-woo. The man who referenced the household, he said. His name is in the meeting notes. I want a complete profile by tomorrow morning. Financial connections. Personal connections. Everything. Understood, Sung-woo said. And I want 2 additional people on the building entrance roster starting tonight, Junho said. Rotating. She does not need to know they are there. Understood, Sung-woo said. He was already pulling up the building security contacts on his phone. On a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after the Incheon meeting, Junho came home and found the apartment dark except for the kitchen light, and Sua asleep and Penelope standing at the kitchen counter with a glass of water and her eyes on the window. She turned when she heard him come in. She looked at his face. She set down the glass and went to the refrigerator without asking and began reheating the covered dish she had left on the shelf. He sat at the counter and watched her move. The Incheon situation is closed, he said. She looked over her shoulder. Fully, he said. The boundaries are documented. The compliance schedule is running. The man who mentioned the household at the meeting has been dealt with separately. She turned back to the reheating food. Dealt with how? He will not be attending any further meetings, Junho said. With anyone. She set the bowl in front of him. She came around the counter and sat on the stool beside him. Not across from him, beside him, closer than across, and looked at his face. Are you done? She asked. For tonight. He looked at her. She was close enough that he could see the small details of her face that he had spent 8 months learning without permission. The specific way her left brow rose slightly when she was asking something she already half knew the answer to. The particular quality of her eyes when she was being direct, which was most of the time. Yes, he said. For tonight. She nodded once and picked up her water glass from where she had set it and held it with both hands. They sat side by side at the kitchen counter with his food between them and the city visible through the window and the apartment quiet around them. And neither of them spoke for a while. And the silence was the specific comfortable silence of 2 people who have stopped needing to fill space between them. He finished eating. He set down his chopsticks. He turned on the stool so he was facing her slightly. I need to ask you something, he said. She looked at him. Sua asked me yesterday to explain what a mother is, he said. Penelope went still. She said Mrs. Yoon told her that mothers were the people who loved you before you knew you needed to be loved, he said. She thought about this for a day, and then she came to my study, and she said she thought Penny was her mother. He looked at Penelope's face. She said she needed to know if she was right. Penelope's hand tightened around the glass. What did you tell her? She asked. Her voice was careful and controlled and nearly steady. I told her I would speak to Penny, he said. She set the glass down on the counter. She pressed both hands flat on the counter surface and looked at the kitchen window and breathed. She is right, Penelope said. She is completely right. He looked at her profile. He reached over and placed his hand over hers on the counter. Warm, deliberate, his palm covering the back of her hand. She looked down at his hand. She turned her hand over and held it. They sat like that in the kitchen with the city outside and Sua asleep down the hallway, and everything that needed to be decided had been decided, and what remained was just the shape of it. The daily, ordinary, permanent shape of it. He proposed on a Tuesday evening. Sua was asleep. The apartment was quiet. Penelope was sitting at the low table near the window with a book open in front of her, and the lamp making a warm circle of light over her, and the necklace at her throat where it always was. He came out of his study and sat across from her at the low table. He placed a small box on the table between them and folded his hands and looked at her. She looked at the box. She looked at his face. I had a ring made once before, he said. I lost it when I lost you. I had another one made 8 weeks ago. He looked at her directly. I will not reconstruct the speech I had prepared 11 years ago. I am not the same person who prepared it. You are not the same person it was prepared for. But I am the same person who chose you then. And I am choosing you now, with the full knowledge of everything that choosing you has cost and everything that it will cost, and the complete absence of any interest in choosing differently. She opened the box. The ring was simple and exact, and it had the same engraving on the inner band as the pendant at her throat. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up at him. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. He took the ring from the box and put it on her hand, and she looked down at it on her finger, and he looked at her looking at it, and the lamp made its warm circle around both of them. From down the hallway. Appa, I need water. Junho looked at Penelope. She pressed her lips together. He stood up and walked down the hallway to his daughter's room. And Penelope sat at the low table with the ring on her finger and listened to the sound of him getting his daughter water, and the quiet sound of Sua's voice, and then the quiet again. She looked at the ring. She held the pendant. N&S. She had carried this necklace through everything. Now she understood what it had been carrying her toward. They were married on a Saturday in early spring. 30 people in a private garden outside the city. People who knew the real story, not the household version, not the public version, but the complete version, with all of its damage and its distance and the stubborn, improbable insistence of two people on finding their way back to the same place. Sua wore a white dress with a yellow ribbon and carried a basket of petals and distributed them along the garden path with extreme precision, pausing twice to redistribute where she felt the coverage was inadequate. She approached this responsibility with the seriousness of someone who had been waiting her whole life to do exactly this. Naledi came down the path in the spring light with the necklace at her throat. Junho watched her walk toward him. He stood at the end of the path with his hands at his sides and his face completely, entirely unmanaged. No professional distance, no controlled expression, none of the careful architecture that ran his face in every other context. Just the face of a man watching a woman walk toward him who had survived everything the world had put between them and had come back. She reached him. She looked up at him. N&S, she said. Quiet. Just for him. Naledi Sio, he said. Just for her. Her name and his voice, given back to her with everything it had ever contained. The officiant spoke. Sua, standing nearby with her empty basket, began a whispered and apparently urgent discussion with the small daughter of one of the guests about the superior design of her dress. Junho heard it. He kept his face composed by considerable effort. Naledi heard it and fixed her gaze on the middle distance with the focused expression of a woman who has decided something specific and is committed to it. They said their words to each other. They meant every word. Every single word was true. 18 months later, Sua sat cross-legged on the living room floor of the apartment and studied the face of her new sibling with the careful attention of a senior researcher encountering new data. The baby was 14 days old. He had a full head of dark hair and the permanent expression of someone who found his current circumstances mildly beneath his expectations. He was in the padded seat on the coffee table, and Sua was 8 inches from his face, examining him. He does not do very much, she said. He will, Naledi said from the sofa. She was sitting with her feet tucked under her and her tea on the armrest, watching her daughter examine her son with the expression of a woman who is completely and exactly where she is supposed to be in the world. When? Sua asked. A few months, Junho said from the armchair. He was watching both his children and his wife. The expression on his face was the one that only this room ever produced in him. No management, no architecture, nothing held back. Every year of what had been survived to get here was visible in it, and every day of what they had built since, and the complete, settled, absolute knowledge of a man who knows exactly what he has and what it cost, and does not look away from either of those truths. Naledi looked at him from the sofa. He looked back at her. Sua said, I have been thinking about his name. We gave him a name, Junho said. I have a better idea, Sua said. What is it? Naledi asked. Sua considered this carefully. I will tell you tomorrow, she said. When I have finished thinking. Junho looked at Naledi. Naledi looked at Junho. They said nothing because they had been parents long enough to know the terrain of this conversation and where it led if you engaged with it at 8 in the evening. Later, after Sua was asleep and the baby was sleeping and the apartment had settled into its night quiet, Naledi started laughing. Sitting on the sofa with her tea, laughing quietly first and then fully, her head tilting back. Junho sat beside her and watched her laugh, and his face did the thing it did in this room, the complete and unguarded thing, and then he pulled her close. She leaned into him with her shoulder against his chest, and her laughter quieting into something warm and steady, and he rested his cheek against the top of her head, and they sat like that while Seoul moved outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, lit up in the dark, the Han River visible in the distance where it had always been. The necklace was on the nightstand in the next room. N&S. 11 years. 3 surgeries. 2 names. 1 child who had reached for both their hands at the same moment at a fountain in a park on a mild autumn morning and pulled them forward. It had always been pointing here. Every single inch of it had always been pointing exactly here. And that is where we leave them. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. I want to ask you a few things because your thoughts genuinely matter to this channel. Was Madame Sio's punishment enough? She lost everything she built. She did not go to prison. Does that sit right with you, or did Junho go too far in how he handled it? Or not far enough? What about Kyle? When Junho sat across from him in that conference room and told him calmly that he owned the company, that his access card would be deactivated at midnight, that his work authorization had encountered a complication, was that the right response? Or was it too much? And which moment hit you the hardest? Was it the pavement, when he stepped out of that car and said 7 words and Kyle walked away? Was it the soup outside the guest room door? The park, when he looked at the mark on her neck and did not yet understand what he was seeing? The kitchen in the rain, when she said her real name and he closed his eyes? The conference table with Kyle? The proposal on a Tuesday evening with Suwa calling for water from down the hall? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this story moved you, please like it. Share it with someone who loves a story that earns every moment it delivers. Subscribe if you have not already, because there are more stories coming and you do not want to miss what is next. My name is Jasmine. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one.